Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear participants, excellencies, dear colleagues. I'm Shariful Islam, representing Minamata Convention Secretariat. Welcome to today's online event, jointly organized by Norway Environmental Agency and AMAP. This is the 16th of the 21 online events organized in the banner of COP5 online events. COP5 events are an informal platform for parties and observers to share information and bring knowledge to advances in technology, research, and policy to the attention of parties and to the global community that the convention serves. Before I hand this over to the moderator of the event, let me go through a few housekeeping notes. As you can see on your screen, this session, you can always adjust your microphone and camera by adjusting your audio and video menu at the top left corner of your screen. You can also find it at the bottom of your screen, and you can adjust your camera, speaker, and microphone. If the moderator opens the floor, you can take the floor by clicking on the raised hand icon that appears at the bottom of your screen. You can also find the raised hand icon on the participant panels next to your name. But we would rather recommend typing your questions and your comments onto the chat panel that is available at the bottom right corner of your screen. Please remember to send everyone if you would like your comment to be viewed by everyone. If you have any technical difficulty, we would recommend putting your comments and sending this to the host. And please remember this session is being recorded and broadcast live on our YouTube channel. And at the end of the event, you will find a post-webinar survey. Please feel free to complete the survey. This will help us improve our service. Thank you very much. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining us today for this Minamata Convention COP5 online event on Arctic, regional, and national mercury assessments to inform the Minamata Convention. I am Sarah Kalhock-Bork, Chair of AMAP, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, a working group of the Arctic Council. And I am joined by my co-convener, Eva Krumel of Inuit Circumpolar Council, whom you will hear from later in the program. Our third co-convener, Trine-Lise Torgersen of the Norwegian Environment Agency, is unfortunately not able to join us today. Today's event will present findings from both the AMAP 2021 assessment of mercury in the Arctic, including its technical report and summary for policymakers, and Norway's National Mercury Assessment. We will hear about the latest data and information on observed trends, human health impacts, and Indigenous peoples' perspectives, as well as new findings on the influence of climate change on mercury fate and transport in the Arctic. The presentations will focus on findings and recommendations that are relevant to the work of the Minamata Convention, and particularly its effectiveness evaluation process. Before we begin, I will offer a little context. AMAP and the Minamata Convention have a long history that is intertwined and complementary, and AMAP is planning for a future that is similarly supportive and reflective of Arctic contributions to the implementation of the Convention. AMAP has produced scientific assessments of mercury in the Arctic since 1998, with the most recent assessment being from 2021. The early scientific information produced by AMAP and the involvement of Indigenous peoples and Arctic countries helped to raise global awareness and concern about mercury contamination of the Arctic as a result of long-range transport. This was of tremendous impact in the negotiations leading up to the Minamata Convention, the preamble of which references the particular vulnerabilities of Arctic ecosystems and Indigenous communities. AMAP carried out joint work with UNEP on the 2013 and 2018 global mercury assessments and plans to continue this support, especially to bring Arctic data and information into the Minamata effectiveness evaluation process. The convention mandates ongoing assessment of its effectiveness, which requires monitoring of mercury pollution. The latest assessment from AMAP provides current scientific information and context that the international community will need to understand the impact of the convention on the Arctic environment and people, and identifies additional research needed to minimize these impacts of mercury. It is my pleasure to now introduce the first three speakers, whose presentations will focus on the findings from the AMAP 2021 assessment of mercury in the Arctic. Our first speaker, John Chetelat, is a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. John is the co-lead of the 2021 AMAP Mercury assessment, and his presentation will provide an overview of the policy-relevant findings and recommendations from this assessment. Our second speaker, Sophie Johnson, is Associate Professor at the Department of Environmental Science at Stockholm University in Sweden. Sophie is a chapter co-lead of the 2021 AMAP Mercury assessment, and her presentation will address climate change influences on mercury transport and fate. Our third speaker, Neil Basu, is a professor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. He has been involved in several AMAP initiatives for over 20 years, and including co-leadership of the Human Health chapter in the latest AMAP Mercury assessment, which he will summarize today. Now, to begin the presentations, John, the floor is yours. John, we can't hear you yet.
Okay, hello. Is this good? Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today. I will begin with an overview of the 2021 AMAP Mercury assessment, and then my colleagues Sophie Johnson and Neil Basu will provide more details on the climate change and human health aspects. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge co-lead Runa Dietz from Aarhus University in Denmark and Simon Wilson with the AMAP Secretariat for their leadership in the preparation of the assessment. So the 2021 AMAP Mercury assessment updates a previous AMAP assessment on mercury that was released over a decade ago. It also builds on AMAP's 2019 assessment of biological effects of contaminants, which includes mercury effects on Arctic fish and wildlife. AMAP brings together data sets of national monitoring programs to provide a regionally integrated assessment of trends on mercury in the Arctic environment. Long-term monitoring data sets of mercury in Arctic air, fish, and wildlife span several decades, often to the early 1990s or before. The relevance of these data sets extends beyond Arctic monitoring. For example, the data were an important contribution to the 2018 UN Environment Global Mercury Assessment. The preparation of the technical report was a large collective effort involving text or data contributions from over 100 scientists from circumpolar Arctic countries and other observing countries. 8 review chapters were produced that summarize the latest science on mercury in the Arctic environment, including temporal trend data sets on mercury concentrations in air and biota, anthropogenic emission sources and transports of mercury to the Arctic, mercury chemical transformations in the Arctic, particularly the production of methylmercury and its bioaccumulation in food webs, influences of climate change on mercury in the Arctic, an assessment of the health risk to Arctic fish and wildlife from mercury exposure, impacts of mercury on human health, model forecasting of mercury concentrations in the Arctic under different future emissions scenarios, and contributions of Indigenous peoples to core research and monitoring of mercury. These topics are covered in detail in the full technical report, which can be downloaded from the AMAP website. In addition, science articles based on the assessment were published in a special issue of Science of the Total Environment. So anthropogenic emissions of mercury occur primarily outside of the Arctic at southern latitudes, and mercury undergoes long-range transport to the Arctic via the atmosphere, ocean currents, and rivers. New research has provided a clearer understanding of the long-range transport of mercury, the complex processes by which it is deposited in the Arctic, and how it moves through polar environments, such as tundra, permafrost, and sea ice, as well as how inorganic mercury is transformed into the more toxic methylmercury in the Arctic. Mercury levels in Arctic fish and wildlife are related to methylmercury cycling and biomagnification through food webs. Marine animals are an important part of traditional diets in many northern communities, and consumption of these wild foods exposes indigenous peoples to mercury. The Arctic is undergoing profound environmental and ecological changes, and there are complex interactions between climate change and mercury in the Arctic. I won't go into more detail here because these climate change influences on mercury will be discussed by Sophie Johnson in the next talk. The most recent global inventory for anthropogenic emissions of mercury is from the 2018 Technical Background Report to the Global Mercury Assessment, where the estimate for global anthropogenic emissions totals around 2,220 tons in the year 2015. Anthropogenic sources within the Arctic region contribute only a small part to global anthropogenic mercury emissions, and that's estimated at less than 1%. Anthropogenic mercury emissions in the Arctic region are from a few non-ferrous metal smelters and coal-fired power plants. Small point source emissions from northern communities are associated with diesel generators and waste dumps. While less than 1% of global mercury emissions are from within the Arctic, Arctic Council member states and observer countries account for around 44% of global human-made emissions. Arctic Council members and observers are therefore well placed to show global leadership under the Minamata Convention and also regionally. Atmospheric mercury concentrations are monitored at several sites in the circumpolar Arctic, and model estimates, such as in the figures here, show broader spatial patterns. The figure on the left shows surface air mercury concentrations in 2015. Atmospheric mercury shows a latitudinal pattern with lower mercury concentrations at higher latitudes, farther away from southern emission sources. This clear latitudinal gradient is consistent with the transport of anthropogenic mercury from lower latitudes to the Arctic. The figure on the right shows the extent of seasonal variation in atmospheric mercury, and the greatest seasonal variation occurs over the Arctic Ocean and marine coastlines, where complex processes occur throughout the year. New research in the last decade on methylmercury in Arctic environments has addressed an important knowledge gap in the Arctic mercury cycle, and these new findings will be highlighted in the next talk. A detailed temporal trend analysis was performed using 77 data sets of invertebrates, fish, birds, and terrestrial and marine mammals. Both increasing and decreasing trends of mercury concentrations in Arctic biota have been observed over the last 2 decades. The inconsistent trends in biota are due to complex environmental processes, some of which are associated with climate change. The findings of this temporal trend analysis have implications for effectiveness evaluation under the Minamata Convention. Different environmental compartments may respond at different rates to reductions in mercury loading, and large reservoirs of legacy mercury contamination may have dampened response times. The findings highlight the need for a broad suite of indicators to evaluate the effectiveness of regulatory actions and the need to enhance links between mercury monitoring and monitoring of changes to local environmental conditions. A summary for policymakers document was released in May 2021, and it highlights key objectives of assessment, which were to provide sound scientific knowledge to support policymaking, to highlight contributions of indigenous knowledge to Arctic mercury assessment, and to support relevant international action, and particularly the Minamata Convention on Mercury. 7 key findings are highlighted in the summary for policymakers, and I will briefly go through them. Number 1, mercury from anthropogenic emissions around the world continues to reach the Arctic through long-range transport. Number 2, people living in the Arctic are among some of the most exposed human populations to mercury. Some Arctic wildlife are also highly exposed to mercury, particularly mammals and seabirds at the top of the marine food chains. Over the last decade, new research has improved our understanding of how mercury makes its way to the Arctic, is transformed to methylmercury, and enters food webs. Interactions between climate change and mercury were largely conceptual or predictive a decade ago, and we now have clear evidence that climate change is affecting mercury in the Arctic, although large uncertainties remain about the long-term implications. 5. Modeled forecasting of mercury concentrations in the Arctic under different future emissions scenarios showed that reductions in global mercury emissions can lower mercury in the Arctic environment in the near and medium terms. Reductions in future anthropogenic emissions are critical to reduce the buildup of mercury in the environment. 6. Arctic mercury monitoring, which is summarized in the AMAP report, will contribute to effectiveness evaluation of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. In particular, the Arctic time series cover the last 20 years or more, allowing for a comparison before and after the Minamata Convention came into force. Indigenous peoples and local communities have played an important role in Arctic research on contaminants and mercury exposure, and the assessment documents examples of Indigenous contributions to mercury research and monitoring from over 40 projects across the circumpolar Arctic. Finally, key recommendations were made based on the findings of the AMAP assessment, and they are to continue efforts with long-term monitoring of mercury, as this science supports policy-making decisions, as well as the evaluation of effectiveness of the Minamata Convention. To strengthen efforts to reduce primary emissions of mercury and continue to support further implementation of the Minamata Convention. And to extend the knowledge base on mercury in the Arctic. In particular, to expand studies of climate change impacts on mercury in the Arctic, as well as improve modeling to evaluate source-receptor relationships. To encourage interdisciplinary research that reflects the complexity of physical, chemical, and biological processes, and to promote the co-production of knowledge with Indigenous organizations by supporting partnerships between Indigenous peoples and scientists and the use of best practices for engagement. For further information, please visit the AMAP website to view the products of the 2020 Mercury Assessment. And thank you for your attention. And I'll pass over the floor to Sophie Johnson.
Thank you, Jan. And as mentioned, I will focus my talk on how climate change influences the transport and fate of the ocean. And in order to discuss these processes, we first need to consider the different chemical species in which we're cycling in the environment. On the right figure here, you see the distribution of different chemical forms of mercury in different Arctic compartments. On the far right, you have emissions of mercury to the air and mercury in the atmosphere. This is dominated by elemental mercury, the same form you might find in all thermometers. If we then move to natural waters, we have soils, sediments, ice, we have mainly mercury, inorganic divalent mercury. Also in the base of aquatic food webs, for example, in phytoplankton, we have mainly mercury as inorganic divalent mercury. But when we move higher up in the food web, they're exemplified by beluga and Arctic cod. We have mainly mercury as methylmercury, and this is also what we are being exposed to. And so in order to link the release of mercury from, for example, coal combustion and small-scale gold mining to the Minamata Convention's goal of protecting human and wildlife health from mercury exposure, we need to understand how and also at what rate mercury is transported and chemically transformed in different environmental compartments. As already stressed in Jan's talk, people living in the Arctic are among some of the most exposed populations globally, and consumption of food harvested from the marine environment is the main exposure pathways. So the Arctic Ocean is a key environment, both because this is where mercury in the Arctic bioaccumulates to high and critical levels, and also we think that this is where most of this methylmercury that is ending up in the is being produced. And for the AMAP assessment, we prepared new budgets for both the total mercury and methyl mercury. Here you see the budget for total mercury, and I'm not going to go into detail, but what I want to stress is that we have around 200 megagram per year, or 200 tons of mercury per year entering the Arctic Ocean from both the terrestrial compartment, other marine systems, the atmosphere, and sediments. If we then have a look at the methyl mercury budget, this was enabled by huge effort by the scientific communities to conduct field studies, so we have much more data to put into this budget than we had previously. And we can see that around a quarter of the mercury in the Arctic Ocean seawater is as methyl mercury. We also can see that typically we have increased concentrations of methyl mercury in the seawater in the zones where you expect a lot of microbial decomposition of sinking algae cells. So in the next step, we also took a look at the different inputs and outputs of methyl mercury into the Arctic oceans. And we have inputs including rivers, coastal erosion, we have inputs from sediments, also to minor extent from atmospheric deposition. And comparing the model outputs and inputs of methyl mercury, we can see that we're missing quite a lot of methyl mercury, suggesting that we have a lot of methyl mercury production within the Arctic Ocean. And this is also likely important contribution to the pool that is then being accumulated food web. And this was also demonstrated in a recent study where they compared different regions in the Canadian Arctic. And they identify that in a region where they have shallow methyl mercury production, they can also see high concentrations of mercury in biota, including, for example, seals and polar bears. So this further stresses the importance of this in situ. So let's now switch to climate change and how climate change might alter the cycling of mercury and what role it plays for the Minamata Convention and the effectiveness evaluation. Northern permafrost soils are known to store a large amount of mercury. And this mercury has been built up over thousands of years together with a lot of carbon. And these stocks have been prevented from re-entering the atmosphere and from reaching aquatic systems by low temperatures and a low decomposition rate of the organic matter. But as these regions are heating up, we have, for example, permafrost thawing. This results in wetter conditions in the soils, which may promote both reduction of mercury, resulting in increased export of mercury up to the atmosphere with potentially global impact. We can also have increased methyl mercury production in these more wetter conditions. And if this mercury is transported to downstream systems, we can also have a local impact if it's being bioaccumulated in the food web. And there, as Jan also mentioned, there have been studies showing that we have increased export of mercury as a result of warming temperatures and thawing permafrost. And in the figure here, you see one example where they looked at the concentrations of both methyl mercury and total mercury upstream and downstream of this retrogressive thaw slump, which is a result of thawing permafrost. You see that the concentration downstreams are significantly higher. There are also similar studies, observations done also for Arctic rivers. So this is one way in which the climate change may alter the exposure of mercury. Another important factor to account for is changes in the web. It is, however, challenging to predict in what way this will alter the levels of biota. It is likely that in some regions we might have lower concentrations in the biota due to altered feeding behavior, for example, while in other regions and for other species we have the opposite and having worsened exposure. And to summarize a bit, in addition to these food web structure changes, shown in my previous slide, we have thawing permafrost. This will likely lead to higher export of mercury and also increased production of methyl mercury. We also have Arctic greening, as well as intensity more fires in the region, and this may alter whether the terrestrial compartment acts as a sink or a source for the atmospheric mercury. We also have melting glaciers, and this will result in increased export of mercury in downstream systems, including could be both lakes as well as a marine system. And for the marine compartment, we have loss of sea ice. This can have multiple consequences. The sea ice acts as a cap, preventing exchange between the atmosphere and the water column. So it might alter the export of mercury between these two. We also have logical changes leading to altered bioaccumulation patterns. And also when we have loss of sea ice, we have more sunlight reaching the water column. So we can have more photochemical processes, which also may alter how much mercury that finally ends up in the food web. And as you can see, it's challenging to predict the net effect climate change will have on the risk of mercury exposure in the Arctic. And this is important to keep in mind when we discuss the Minamata Convention and its effectiveness evaluation. We need to keep in mind that different compartments will have different response times. For the atmosphere, we can expect quick responses, but we need to be prepared for longer time scales before we can see that these lower concentrations in the atmosphere or lower emission of mercury to that also results in lower export of mercury from terrestrial compartments into the Arctic Ocean, as well as lower concentrations in the ocean and the food webs. Processes occurring within the Arctic, which are driven by climate change, might also temporarily counteract efforts to reduce our emissions of mercury. And this further stresses the urgency of the convention and for it to be successful. And with that, I will leave over to Neil.
What we'll do now is to summarize our contribution towards the latest AMAP Mercury assessment report in terms of the human health dimensions. So as our moderator, Sarah, had mentioned at the beginning, Arctic populations, and especially the health research from the Arctic, has been quite important in contributing to the Minamata Convention. Article 1 of the convention clearly states that a key objective is to protect human health. And when we read the preamble text, we see that there is clear mention that Arctic peoples, especially indigenous communities, are particularly vulnerable to mercury because the mercury in the Arctic can build up in the food chain and contaminate very important traditional, culturally appropriate foods, while also affecting the health of such communities. When we look at the importance of AMAP over the years in terms of mercury health science, it's been profound. The AMAP reports for several decades now have brought together leading health researchers from across Arctic Council countries, from across Arctic regions, to critically bring together the state of science concerning mercury and its health impacts. And in doing so, we can take a look at the evidence base, which is very clear. First off is that Arctic populations worldwide are amongst the most highly exposed to mercury. Number two is that when we understand how these mercury exposures are realized, we see that it's largely through the consumption of traditional country foods. And number three, what we see is that the exposures to mercury are sufficiently high enough to cause toxicological effects such as neurodevelopmental changes and cardiovascular issues, as well as now with a broader focus on public health, we see that the contamination of Arctic ecosystems and foods can also lead to a range of public health issues spanning from food security to mental health and well-being. So out of our chapter, there were three key points I want to highlight. Number one concerns food security. So as I mentioned, the foods that are important to Arctic populations, especially indigenous ones, such as meats from marine mammals and some fish species, are contaminated with mercury, sometimes at relatively high levels of mercury. Unfortunately, avoiding these foods is not an option. When we look at the nutritional value of these foods, they're high, they're superior, they're much better than what can be purchased from the store. These are also foods that are promoted by health officials, while also foods that have really important dimensions to people and their cultural health and spirituality. They're foods that bring communities together to harvest and share. They're foods that are really critical to the fabric of communities in the Arctic. So avoiding them is not an option. What we also see, unfortunately, in the Arctic is that there is a transition concerning diet and nutrition underway. This dietary and nutrition transition is being sort of pushed forward through changing hunting practices, which may be exacerbated by climate change. The transition is also being fueled by industrialization of food markets and trade. This is also leading to higher prices in local stores, raising further concerns about availability and access, while also making available food that are of inferior nutritional quality compared to traditional foods. All this together emphasizes the need to look at communities in the Arctic from a food security perspective. And when you look at the literature and the data, food insecurity is high. Whereas globally, food insecurity plagues about 10% of the world's population, when we look at places in the Arctic, it can be in excess of 60%. So the issue of food security, which has a mercury dimension, is of concern in the Arctic. Number two is that when we look at the involvement of Arctic indigenous peoples and Arctic countries, they have been critical to the Minamata Convention. And to this day, these groups remain very active on national and international forums. And again, a lot of this engagement is fueled from communities and their concerns about mercury and its impact on health. What we see at another level is that these same organizations and groups are quite active now in the co-production of knowledge and research activities. There are many examples of collaborative and equitable research partnerships between Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples with Western science researchers. And what we see is that when we fuse together Western scientific approaches and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous approaches in a co-equitable manner, that the outcomes are ones that lead to much better science, public health messaging that is on target, and overall risk communication that is more tailored and appropriate to the communities that matter. And we feel this is important to highlight, given that it took a while for the Arctic research community to get to this point. And now that we're there are important lessons to be shared with communities elsewhere as they pursue research activities in their different geographical regions. Number three is that even though we see that in some areas in the Arctic that mercury levels may be decreasing in human populations, the levels are still high. The levels that we see in people through biomonitoring programs in the Arctic, especially in the Inuit, remain amongst the highest worldwide. So when we look at levels of mercury in blood or hair from these populations, in many instances, they exceed health guidelines. In many instances, we would conclude that these would be associated with adverse health impacts. We know this for mercury, and we also know that mercury can interact with other chemical stressors and non-chemical stressors that unfortunately, the interactions of this, even though we believe are occurring and likely having tangible impacts on health, the research is less clear on this. What we've also learned about health research in the Arctic is that community-based studies and local-led biomonitoring programs are important. They're important because it's just another way to better empower communities to do public health research and monitoring. But this type of information has been very important for us to characterize exposure and trends, and ultimately to track the effectiveness of various actions that are taken in the Arctic. It's this type of work that has been going on in the Arctic for several decades now. which also demonstrates how different countries and different researchers can come together, how diverse data sources can be brought together to gain deeper and far-reaching insights. So this is the approach that was taken when members involved in this chapter and in AMAP reports concerning mercury in the Arctic came together and made pretty strong contributions towards the 2018 UN Global Mercury Assessment. So as we think about how to do effectiveness evaluation for the Minamata Convention, again, there are important lessons to be learned from this type of work. When we look at the conclusions of the biomonitoring programs, they link back to our overall takeaways from mercury health research in the Arctic. One is that the mercury levels in the Arctic amongst populations remain amongst the highest in the world. These types of studies continue to show us that the exposures are largely realized from country foods, traditional foods that are really important to communities, and that the levels are associated with health impacts, which can range from subtle or subclinical effects on neurodevelopment or cardiovascular disease, all the way to broader issues of public health concerns, such as food security and overall well-being. So with that being said, I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you to our first set of speakers, John Chedlat, Sophie Johnson, Neil Basu, for such informative presentations on a wide range of topics from the AMAP 2021 assessment. Clearly, as we've heard from these presentations, more efforts are still needed to eliminate mercury and reduce its impact on human health and the environment in the Arctic. Providing knowledge as a basis for action is at the core of AMAP's mandate from the Arctic Council and is also a core issue for the current Norwegian chairship of the Arctic Council. In Norway, there was a desire to follow up on AMAP's regional assessment at a national level. And so Norway initiated work on a national assessment, with the main goal being to evaluate the effectiveness of Norwegian mercury regulations and policies on management of mercury, but also to shed light on how future research and monitoring efforts can be developed to provide us all with the policy relevant information we need. The Norwegian National Assessment is the result of a cross-disciplinary effort among experts from 6 research institutions. With us today, we have Hans Fredrik Bratten from the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, who will give us an overview of the work that has been done. Please take the floor, Hans Fredrik.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for this opportunity to present the Norway's National Mercury Assessment. It's impossible for me in 10 minutes now to present the whole of the assessment, of course, but hopefully I will be able to give you a few highlights. The main question that we wanted to answer with this assessment was what are the effects of national, regional and international regulations and policies on mercury in Norway. We wanted to do that by evaluating the connections between these 3 topics. First, the national and European and international policies and regulations that are relevant for mercury in Norway. We wanted to link that to emissions, releases, and the use of mercury. And then we wanted to link exposure pathways to concentrations of mercury in the environment. And I will focus here on some of the temporal trends that we have investigated. The time frame here is the last 20 years. So most of the data, with some exceptions, goes back to the year 2000. Just a few words about human exposure in Norway before I get into some other details. So dental amalgam and fish consumption are the 2 main exposure pathways for mercury to humans in Norway. As with other comparable countries, dental amalgam was widely used in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s in Norway. A large survey showed that total mercury concentrations in human blood samples was reduced in the period between 2002 and 2008. and that this was partially explained by the number of dental tooth fillings, amalgam tooth fillings. And this we can relate back to the fact that this technique was phased out in the early 90s. When it comes to fish consumption, Norway has maybe not strongly communicated, but we have actually a nationwide freshwater fish consumption advice for selected species. When it comes to marine fish, we have a more local framed fish consumption advice, and I will come back to that when I show some of that data later. The figure on the right doesn't really seem to be working, but it's not extremely important. An assessment from the early 2000s showed that almost 90% of dietary intake of total mercury in Norway is from fish and seafood. So a few words about management of mercury in Norway and how this is done. Here I'm going to show you just a few highlights. Don't worry if you can't read what the figure shows. But mercury is managed in Norway on 3 different levels. First, we have the relevant international regulations. And one example here is the Convention of Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, of course, even though mercury was not implemented there until the 90s. So this is important for mercury management in Norway. Then we also have regional regulations, and in Norway this is EU regulations and directives that are implemented in Norway through the European Economic Area Agreement, even though Norway is not part of the EU. And here we separate between regulations and directives, and regulations, they are automatically implemented in Norwegian legislation. And then we have a long range of national regulations on mercury in Norway, dating back to particularly the 90s. And in fact, these were so strict in Norway that when the Minamata Convention was ratified, no further regulations were needed in Norway to comply with the convention. Okay, then a little bit of data. First, a few words about deposition of mercury in Norway and atmospheric concentrations. The figure on the left here shows the relative contribution of mercury deposition to Norway, and more than 80% comes from sources outside of Europe. That's the yellow part of those bars on that figure. And relatively, this contribution has gone up since the 90s, and this is because of a decline in emissions in Europe. And this is what you see on the figure on the right. The red line shows emissions of mercury in Europe, and the black dotted line shows how this has affected the wet deposition of mercury in the south of Norway. So this is monitoring data from the south of Norway. A few examples of use, emissions, and releases. Norway, as other comparable Scandinavian countries, have had, maybe not a big, but a significant chloralkali industry until the 90s. And we have several examples of local areas with severe mercury pollution due to chloralkali industry. Historically, the metal industry has been the largest emitter of mercury. There was restrictions on this in the 90s, and emissions have gone down. And we see the same with the use of products, where these were quite restricted in the early 90s, particularly batteries, thermometers, and other electric products. The figure on the right shows the releases to land in Norway. These are declining and relatively low in 2020, less than 10 kilograms. These releases to land, we have tried to relate to mercury concentrations in biota, and I'll give a few examples on that now. So a few years ago, there was a large freshwater fish mercury database that was analyzed for the whole of Scandinavia. And we have taken out a few lakes from that database to study in more detail. And here we have 2 lakes. One is called Lake Mjøsa, the largest lake in Norway, where there are several potential sources of mercury pollution in the catchment, including industry and urban areas. And then we have Lake Femunden located a bit further to the north, where there are no known local pollution sources of mercury in the catchment. They are both exposed to long-range transport, of course, of mercury, and that's what you see on the figure on the right, the deposition flux to the catchments, with the catchment located furthest north having the lowest deposition flux. And here the trends of declining flux, the deposition is declining since the 90s, but we don't see this pattern when we look at mercury concentrations in the fish. So here we see populations of perch from these two lakes, and we don't see any significant trends that can be explained by the differences in sources between the lakes or these declines in long-range transport of mercury. And this pattern is also found when we look at Arctic mammals and marine fish species. So here are some examples from Svalbard, a group of islands north of Norway, when we have analyzed mercury in polar bear hair and Arctic fox liver. And we see the same mercury concentrations in these samples do not follow the deposition flux or the air concentrations of mercury. And as you all know, there are multiple steps involved, of course, in the mercury uptake and transfer of mercury through the food webs. There are many steps between deposition of mercury and the uptake of mercury in the top parts of the food webs, which make these connections extremely complicated to make. We see the same for marine fish, where we see clear spatial gradients from the south of Norway to the north, with the deposition of mercury being highest in the south and also the mercury concentrations in fish, and then a decline of both as we move further north. But again, we don't see any temporal trends that can be explained by releases and emissions of mercury. So to conclude, what are the effects of national and international regulations and policies on mercury in Norway? How the changing releases and emissions connects to environmental trends and concentrations of mercury in biota is extremely complicated due to both long-range and local sources of mercury, and also because of the range of post-depositional processes that are involved in transformation and transport of mercury. So we heard this also from the AMAP presentations, that in order to separate drivers of observed long-term trends of mercury, there is a need for supporting measurements and supporting data that enables better analysis of these cause-effect relationships. So what is needed? We definitely need more supporting measurements. Climate change has already been mentioned, emissions and releases of mercury, and also more data on the trophic transfer. Modeling could be an example of it, something that could give us more information, and also release and emission practices to say more about specific local sources and local lakes, for example, or populations of interest. So with that, I'm going to say thank you and for giving me this opportunity. And of course, I thank you to all my co-authors. 6 other institutes were involved, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hans Fredrik, for your presentation. I'm Eva Krümmel, working for the Inuit Circumpolar Council. I guess you can see my picture not very well, my streaming right now, because the windows in the background. But if anybody has questions, please add them in the chat. Or maybe if you can raise your hand, you can also do that, and we'll give you the microphone if that's a possibility for you. And while people are thinking what kind of questions they might want to ask, I just wanted to let you know that as you just saw, the presentation have given an overview of the work done as part of the mercury monitoring that is summarized in AMAP assessments. And the Inuit Circumpolar Council, ICC, is very active within AMAP. We are one of the permanent participants. active in that work, which is the indigenous organizations that are active in Arctic Council. And we have also co-led the Chapter 9 in the AMAP assessment that John mentioned earlier. So if you're interested to learn more about how indigenous peoples in the Arctic contribute to Mercury research, please have a look at that chapter. And ICC is also very active within the work of the Minamata Convention. And what we have found in the Minamata Convention, when we looked at the monitoring work overall globally, is that there's really lacking of monitoring in other parts, particularly in the way that's done within AMAP, for example. And one example is the Amazon, where Mercury is used in artisanal small-scale gold mining, and that's currently the largest global source of mercury. So therefore, the indigenous peoples in the Amazon are greatly impacted by mercury contamination, and that resonates very much with Inuit who are greatly impacted by mercury, which is the Arctic, which is reaching the Arctic from sources in the south, as Neil already told you earlier. So now Inuit and the indigenous peoples in the Amazon are working together and raise awareness to attempt to build capacity for mercury monitoring in the Amazon in a similar way as is done in the Arctic. And to that extent, we are organizing a knowledge lab during the COP5 of the Minamata Convention, and that is titled Indigenous Peoples in the Arctic and the Amazon, Monitoring Experiences and Implementation and Effectiveness Evaluation of the Minamata Convention. And that will take place on Wednesday, November 1st in room 1. And I'm going to paste the link in the chat box for those of you who are attending the COP in person. Unfortunately, we can't stream it on the internet. So with that, I do not see any questions in the chat, but maybe others can. So yeah, please let me know if anybody has questions that people could answer. And if there are no other questions, I think I'll hand it over to Sarah for some closing remarks. Oh, there Liz has a question. So Liz, I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but she's asking John. So maybe you want to answer that directly, John, or Liz, if you want to ask her questions.
So could you please read the question to me? I'm not.
Oh, sorry, John, apparently you can't see it. So Liz is asking, apparently she can't unmute herself. There are 2,220 tons of emission in the air and only 14 tons is in the Arctic, north of 60. Is there a chance it would be more? Because I just did a community tour. So unfortunately, she can't unmute herself. I'm not sure if anybody else could. So this is saying an elder found a balloon.
Yeah, so there are those are estimates from 2015. So they are now being they're somewhat starting to become dated. And I think the main point, these are estimates, but I think the main point with the 14 tons in the Arctic is that it's the anthropogenic or human-caused emissions of mercury in the Arctic are much less than total global emissions, anthropogenic emissions, and that the main source of mercury or anthropogenic sources of mercury to the Arctic come from outside the Arctic and through long-range transport.
Of course. Liz, did that answer your question? I mean, I'm not sure if she can be unmuted. Because Liz is saying that the balloon was let go in Iowa, and in 24 hours it was found in Minamata. So,
Yeah.
Which just shows how mercury travels probably similarly quickly.
It really does exemplify that long-range transport of mercury from lower latitudes.
Thank you, John. Liz, did that answer your question? Or if you have a follow-up, please put it in the chat. And also, if there are any other questions. Okay, Liz says yes, that's fine, great. Then we have a question from Petra Vlasov. What is the main source of mercury in permafrost?
So I can answer that. So these permafrost systems have been built up for thousands of years. So it's to a small extent that, but primarily this is natural emissions of mercury from, for example, volcanoes that's been emitting mercury for thousands of years. And these have been then captured in this permafrost environment and bound together with the carbon in the soil. And so it's a re-emission of previous naturally emitted mercury that due to human perturbations is then emitted back into the atmosphere or transported downstream.
Thank you, Sophie. So we are in the last few minutes, and Sarah lost contact apparently, but Simon is going to close the session. So Simon, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, Sarah lost connection. So, but fortunately, I have a script she provided earlier, so I can read this. And so, as Sarah has already mentioned, the work of AMAP and the Arctic scientists and the Arctic indigenous peoples has played a significant role in the establishment of the Minamata Convention, as reflected in a preamble to the convention. And as per Article 22 of the convention, it is now time to evaluate the effectiveness of the convention. Work is underway to establish arrangements for this effectiveness evaluation that include a provision for comparable monitoring data on the presence and movement of mercury and mercury compounds in the environment, as well as trends in levels of mercury and mercury compounds observed in both biotic media and vulnerable populations. The Arctic monitoring and assessment work of AMAP, which is underpinned by national monitoring programs such as in Norway and by meaningful partnerships with Indigenous people, has been recognised as one of the best examples of a regional mercury monitoring system that can help to assess the effectiveness of the Minamata Convention. It is a long-term and sustained activity. It's been going on for more than 30 years now, and AMAP is therefore well positioned to continue to support the convention's further implementation. And we would welcome being used as a possible model for other regional collaborations. So to sum up, we hope that you've taken away some of the key messages from these presentations, considered the recommendations for policymakers, have a deeper understanding of the importance of long-term perspectives, especially when considering mercury trends against the backdrop of rapid climate change. We hope too that you've come away from this event with a greater awareness of the experience of collaborative work carried out in the Arctic at the regional level, the national level, and by Arctic indigenous populations, and that this, in turn, has given you some ideas about how regional and national monitoring and assessment efforts can inform and contribute to the work of the Minamata Convention, and in particular its effectiveness evaluation. So, on behalf of the co-conveners of this session, thank you again to the presenters for their excellent presentations, and to our virtual audience online also today for your time and your participation. And finally, for those attending the COP5 in Geneva this month, I'd also like to mention that AMAP and the Canadian Northern Contaminants Programme will have an exhibition booth where you can find out more about our work. So, wishing you a good rest of your day and a successful COP5. It's time to close the event. Thank you.